In 1912, a German shipyard launched a yacht worth over $4 million in today's money. Mahogany over oak, brass fittings imported from England, teak decks hand-fitted plank by plank. It was built for Kaisers, for men who owned more than just the boat. By 1930, it belonged to Benito Mussolini, a floating palace where a dictator could disappear offshore, beyond witnesses, beyond records. In 1943, it was deliberately sunk to prevent Nazi capture. 4 years later, it was raised, restored, renamed, and in 2006, a businessman connected to Rome's Mafia network bought it for 2.4 million euros, then spent nearly 4 million more making it perfect. The money came from public funds, contracts meant to house refugees, care for the displaced, feed the desperate. Instead, it paid for varnish, for velvet, for brass polished to mirror brightness. This is the dark story of how the Mafia took over Mussolini's superyacht, Black Flame. One vessel, 3 regimes, the same hunger for dominance. Did the yacht survive history, or did history keep choosing it? We're going to cover everything, from the yacht's inception to its history and the experience of sailing on it, all the way until the fateful day of its takeover, and what came after. The yacht was born in 1912 in a shipyard on the German coast at a moment when Europe still believed in its own invincibility. Abeking and Rasmussen. The name itself sounds like precision, like inherited authority. The firm had already built vessels for Kaisers, for industrialists, for men who wanted the world to see them coming from miles away. This one was different, not because of its size, though at 32 meters it was substantial, but because of its lines. Clean, deliberate, a 2-masted schooner designed to move through water like a blade through silk. They called it Königin II, Queen the Second. It was launched in April, just months before the Titanic went down. That proximity is worth noting, because while one ship became a symbol of hubris punished, the other would become something quieter, more patient, a vessel that learned to survive by adapting to whoever held the wheel. The hull was mahogany over oak. The decks were teak, hand-fitted. The rigging was German linen, waxed to repel salt. Brass fittings throughout, no expense spared. It wasn't just a yacht, it was a statement. Wealth that moved, power that could disappear over the horizon and return at will. 32 meters stem to stern, 8 meters at the beam. A draft shallow enough to hug coastlines, deep enough to cross open water. 2 masts, gaff-rigged. Sails totaling 420 square meters when fully deployed. Below deck, 6 staterooms, a galley designed for extended voyages, a salon paneled in walnut with inlaid marquetry, storage for 6 weeks of provisions, freshwater capacity for 12 souls. This wasn't a racing yacht. It was built for presence, for arriving somewhere and making clear that whoever stepped off owned more than just the boat. And in 1912, that's exactly what yachts like this were for. They were the private jets of their era, mobile territories, floating embassies of wealth. You didn't sail one of these to escape the world. You sailed it to remind the world you could leave whenever you chose. But here's what's easy to forget. A yacht like this doesn't just exist. It demands. It needs a crew, engineers, deckhands, a captain who knows more than how to read the wind. Maintenance is constant. Varnish degrades, brass tarnishes, wood swells and contracts with humidity. Sails tear, rigging stretches. A vessel like Königin II requires attention the way a cathedral requires devotion, and someone has to pay for it. For the first 18 years of its life, the yacht moved between private owners, industrialists, minor aristocracy, people whose names have been lost to history because they weren't interesting enough to survive it. The vessel changed hands quietly. No scandals, No drama, just wealth circulating among the wealthy. Until 1930. That's when Alessandro Parisi Nobile acquired it. Now, Nobile is a name that requires context. He was not merely wealthy. He was connected. A businessman with holdings in construction, in shipping, in industries that thrived when governments needed things built quickly and didn't ask too many questions about the bills. Italy in 1930 was a country remade. Benito Mussolini had been in power for 8 years. The fascist party had restructured the state, nationalized industries, and created a system where proximity to power was the only currency that mattered. Nobile understood this. He didn't just support the regime, he invested in it. Contracts, donations, public displays of loyalty. And in 1930, he bought Mussolini's regime a gift. Not openly, not as a headline, but the yacht, renamed, refitted, and presented as a gesture of esteem, became the personal retreat of Il Duce himself. Why a yacht? Why not a villa, a palace, an estate? Because a yacht offers something land never can: isolation without exile. A dictator surrounded by subordinates is still surrounded. A dictator on a boat, miles offshore, is alone with whoever he allows aboard. The vessel becomes a world unto itself. No witnesses, no records, no interruptions. Just water and silence and whoever controls the wheel. Mussolini understood spectacle. His public persona was theater, the jutting jaw, the uniforms, the balcony speeches. But power, real power, requires privacy. A place to shed the costume, to speak freely, to indulge without performance. The yacht gave him that. The schooner was refitted. The salon was redesigned with heavier furniture, more suited to the weight of authority. New navigation equipment, a more powerful auxiliary engine. German-built, naturally. The staterooms were reconfigured. One in particular, larger, more private, with a door that locked from the inside. Because by the mid-1930s, Mussolini's marriage to Rachele was a formality, a public necessity. His private life had shifted elsewhere, to Claretta Petacci. She was 24 when they met. He was 50. She was beautiful, educated, from a respectable Roman family. He was the most powerful man in Italy. The relationship was an open secret among the elite, invisible to everyone else. And the yacht became their sanctuary. Here's what the yacht offered that no villa, no borrowed estate, no borrowed palazzo could: movement, unpredictability, privacy enforced by distance. If you wanted to find Mussolini on land, you could. You could follow him, intercept him, demand an audience. But if the yacht left port, he was unreachable. No phones, no telegrams, just the sea and silence and the hum of the engine at night. The crew knew to be discreet. They were selected for loyalty, not skill. Deckhands who understood that seeing nothing was part of the job. A captain who knew how to read weather and also how to forget routes. A cook who prepared meals and never mentioned who ate them. This is where history becomes texture. The yacht wasn't just a backdrop. It was architecture designed for control. Narrow corridors that funneled movement. Staterooms that could be sealed. A deck where voices carried so conversations happened below. Ventilation that made certain sounds audible in certain cabins, deliberately, because Mussolini was paranoid, and paranoia requires information. Claretta would board at night, sometimes in Ostia, sometimes farther south along the coast. She'd arrive in a car with dimmed headlights, escorted by men who said nothing. The yacht would already be waiting, engines idling, crew at their posts. She'd step aboard, and within minutes they'd be moving. No logs of these trips survive, or rather, the logs that do survive are sanitized. Dates, destinations, weather conditions. Nothing about passengers, nothing about purpose. Just the bureaucratic fiction that the yacht was being used for state inspections or naval consultations. But the velvet cushions in the main stateroom were imported from Lyon. The sheets were Egyptian cotton, replaced weekly. The galley kept champagne chilled and specific wines Mussolini preferred. There was a gramophone and records, opera mostly, though some jazz slipped in, despite the regime's public contempt for American decadence. The yacht was luxury pretending to be utility, and luxury in a fascist state is never neutral. Because while Mussolini sailed, Italy was preparing for war. Contracts were being signed, alliances forming, military budgets expanding, public funds redirected. And here, offshore, beyond sight of land, the man orchestrating it all was varnishing his private life with stolen elegance. The yacht knew this, not consciously, ships don't think, but it absorbed it, the way wood absorbs smoke, the way brass tarnishes in salt air. The yacht became complicit by proximity. It carried power. It hid indiscretion. It survived by being useful to whoever held the deed. By 1943, the world had turned. The Allies had landed in Sicily. Mussolini had been deposed, arrested, then rescued by German commandos in a desperate propaganda stunt. The Italian state was fracturing. The fascist regime, once so certain of its permanence, was collapsing into factions and betrayals. And someone made a decision about the yacht. Not Mussolini, he was too far gone by then, a puppet of the Germans, ruling a rump state in the north with no real authority. But someone close to the yacht's history, someone who understood what it represented. They scuttled it, deliberately, methodically, not in a panic, but with intention. The yacht was sailed to a specific location off the coast near La Spezia. Valves were opened, seacocks released. Water began flooding the lower compartments. The crew, what remained of it, evacuated in a small tender. Within hours, the yacht slipped beneath the surface and settled on the seabed 30 meters down. Why? The official reason? To prevent Nazi seizure. The Germans were confiscating everything of value: yachts, estates, art collections, anything that could be repurposed or sold to fund the war effort. Sinking the yacht meant denying them a symbol. But there's another explanation. Symbols can be liabilities. The yacht had been Mussolini's floating palace. It had carried his secrets. If it fell into the wrong hands, Allied intelligence, partisan investigators, journalists after the war, what might they find? What logs might still exist? What letters? What photographs? What evidence of who had been aboard and when? Better to erase it. Let the sea do what archives couldn't. And so, the yacht died. Officially, publicly, it lay on the seabed for 4 years. Kelp grew along the railings. Silt filled the cabins. Fish nested in the salon where Mussolini had once held court. The sea, patient and indifferent, began the work of erasure. But the yacht was not forgotten, because in 1947, with the war over and Italy struggling to rebuild, someone decided it was worth recovering. Salvage operations are expensive. You need specialized equipment, divers trained in deep retrieval, pumps capable of displacing tons of seawater, rigging to lift a waterlogged hull without tearing it apart. It's not a project undertaken lightly, but the yacht was raised. Why? Officially for historical preservation, a relic of Italy's maritime heritage, a vessel of cultural significance. But here's what's harder to explain. Who paid for it? Salvage operations don't fund themselves. Italy in 1947 was broke. Infrastructure was shattered, millions displaced, food shortages, a government barely functioning. And yet, resources were allocated to raise a fascist dictator's pleasure yacht from the seabed. Someone wanted it back. The yacht was towed to a shipyard, not Abiking and Rasmussen. Germany was in ruins, but a yard in Genoa with the skills to restore it. The hull was inspected. Structural damage was minimal. The sinking had been controlled, the water relatively shallow. The wood had swelled but not rotted. The brass fittings were tarnished but intact. Restoration began. New rigging, new sails, the auxiliary engine rebuilt, the interior stripped and refinished. The walnut paneling in the salon was salvaged and restored. The staterooms were reconfigured again, smaller, more modern. The yacht was no longer a dictator's hideaway, it was being reborn as something else. But what? Because here's where the yacht's history becomes deliberately vague. The records from the late 1940s and 1950s are incomplete. Ownership transferred several times. Private buyers whose names appear in registries but nowhere else. Shell companies, holding firms. The yacht moved between ports, Genoa, Naples, Palermo. It was chartered occasionally, used for private parties, corporate retreats, weddings. But it was never famous. It was never advertised. It moved quietly, the way expensive things do when their owners prefer discretion. And then, at some point in the late 1950s or early 1960s, it was renamed. No longer Königin II, no longer tied to its German origins or its fascist associations. Now, it was called Fiamma Nera, Black Flame. The name is interesting, not neutral, not comforting. A black flame doesn't exist in nature. Fire is red, orange, yellow. Black flame is a contradiction, an impossibility, or a metaphor. For what? The name suggests something that burns without light, power that consumes without being seen. It's a name chosen by someone who understood symbolism, who wanted the yacht to carry weight without explanation. And for decades, it did. The yacht passed through private hands, wealthy Italians, European aristocrats with coastal estates, businessmen who needed a venue that suggested success without ostentation. It was maintained impeccably, varnish refreshed annually, sails replaced when they frayed, engines serviced by specialists. The yacht never looked old. It looked like money. But money has a way of attracting questions. By the 1990s, Italy was grappling with systemic corruption, investigations into organized crime, judicial inquiries into the relationship between business, politics, and violence. The Mafia, Cosa Nostra, 'Ndrangheta, Camorra had infiltrated nearly every sector of the economy, and investigators were learning to follow the symbols, because criminals, like dictators, collect objects that validate power. A Rolex doesn't just tell time. A Ferrari doesn't just transport. A historic yacht doesn't just sail. They announce ownership. They say, I can afford this. I deserve this. I belong here. And when investigators started looking at who owned Fiamma Nera in the early 2000s, they found a name that interested them. Salvatore Squillante. We'll return to him. But first, we need to understand what the yacht had become. Not just a vessel, not just a piece of maritime history, but a totem, an object that connected whoever possessed it to a lineage of absolute authority, from Kaisers to fascists to modern elites. The yacht had survived wars, regime changes, and decades of scrutiny by remaining exactly what it always was: beautiful, expensive, and quietly complicit. It didn't ask questions. It didn't volunteer information. It simply existed, waiting for the next owner to claim it. And claim it they did. The yacht didn't emerge from history cleanly limped, but the person of simply was follow waiting it out in the tilt chattel. The yacht continue to begin in other prevent reveals that everything they can to learn. They did not the footably happened in the world home and the just from wrist, and claim it they did. The yacht didn't emerge from history into the newert, the obvious problem ahead. The yacht didn't emerge from history and madely they've been able to ext by yacht vermaged all the head in surprise them. Because of dehem they act this morning, the major full of it, that Salvatore Squillante. The yacht didn't emerge from history. and minal smokely in improving different dums and energy portical. It makes that for more group in the other case in the earth. But the fact that the fitly is follow serpent was anyone who emerged, then one begins to true hits passage. But also the after the most part of that program that visited that they must seen the next one to place the David of the note. The first following history was outscreened that the ground for the first following forming to bring it a beautiful in for the bid. The ghost then one breathed to datist in mornant. The author of the yacht was nom the overplace that work from living the video of the additional, but from more follow is there. The number of the peach to true, reveal the classes in the first that received that program is even other quickly. The just is a bit of the invenced to the invenced. The yacht didn't emerge from history, by the time the real given the money, but the do is no one is absolutely. The yacht didn't emerge from history and real became in money and given to claim it. The just is not remained. The yacht was the real video deliver mark and of watered again in the first follow, a market bering recognised, which means partly begins to come just of south, but they found 6% for mudget lease, they did not credibly absolute to the churcher. The provincial object that is much of quenches into money, meg not figured us, but there finds something what is happen, and did not remain it to lead the very sinner of the avoider. The yacht didn't earn it events to do what it order believed back in to get some projections, in what we're going to this energy port, be placed that the footable seam is wid to wevert again, but them that we have just what to do. The yacht didn't emerge from history. 300. Inside, from history, clearly, waiting for the next owner to claim it, and claim it emerge from history cleanly. Nothing does. By the time Salvatore Squillante acquired Fiamma Nera in the early 2000s, the vessel had passed through enough hands that its provenance had become a kind of blurred resume, owned by this industrialist, chartered by that family, restored by someone else, moored here, then there. The records existed, but they didn't tell a story. They told logistics, which is often how wealth prefers it. Squillante was 68 when investigators first took serious interest in him. Not young, but not elderly. The kind of age where a man's patterns have calcified into lifestyle, where what he owns isn't aspiration anymore. It's consolidation. On paper, he was legitimate. Businessman, real estate holdings, investments in hospitality, in construction, in sectors that sound respectable because they involve paperwork and permits and quarterly filings. He had offices in Rome, a villa outside the city, properties along the coast, the yacht, obviously, several high-end vehicles, art, wine collections stored in climate-controlled facilities. The math was the problem. Italian tax authorities are not naive. They understand that wealth can be hidden, that income can be structured, that certain expenses can be classified in ways that reduce liability. They expect this, but they also track patterns. They look at declared income versus observable spending. They compare what someone claims to earn with what they demonstrably own. And Squillante's numbers didn't reconcile. His declared income, averaged over 15 years, suggested a comfortable upper-middle-class existence. Respectable, stable, the kind of wealth that buys a nice apartment and a German sedan. But he owned a historic yacht that required annual maintenance costs exceeding 6 figures. He had a full-time crew on retainer. He held property in 3 cities. His wine collection alone was valued at over €1 million. The villa had been renovated twice in a decade. Not repairs, renovations. Marble imported from Carrara, custom cabinetry. A wine cellar dug 30 feet into bedrock. The disproportion was glaring. Now, in most countries, this might prompt an audit, a polite inquiry, a request for clarification. But Italy has a particular legal framework for addressing wealth that doesn't make sense. It's called preventive seizure, codified in the Rognoni-Lattore law, And it functions on a principle that makes economists uncomfortable and civil libertarians furious. If you can't explain where your wealth came from, the state can take it. Not as punishment for a crime, yet, but as prevention, as a precaution. The logic is simple if authoritarian. Organized crime generates enormous profits. Those profits need to be laundered, invested, converted into assets that appear legitimate. Real estate, businesses, luxury goods. And if the state waits until it can prove a criminal conviction, the assets will have been moved, hidden, or transferred. So the law allows seizure based on disproportion alone. You don't need to prove someone is a criminal. You just need to prove they're living like one without a legitimate explanation. This is where Squillante's name started appearing in investigative files. Not because of a single incident, not because he was caught doing something overtly illegal, but because his lifestyle suggested a revenue stream that wasn't visible. And when investigators started looking at where his money went, they found connections that interested them. To a network, a cooperative technically, a consortium of businesses and social service providers operating in and around Rome, contracts with the city government, partnerships with regional agencies, funding from the European Union for migrant reception programs, for social housing initiatives, for integration services. The network had a name, though it wasn't official. Journalists would later call it Mafia Capitale, Capital Mafia, Rome's Mafia, not the Sicilian Cosa Nostra, not the Calabrian 'Ndrangheta, something newer, more fluid, a criminal structure that didn't rely on blood oaths and territorial control, but on paperwork and access, on knowing which bureaucrat to call, which contract to bid on, which services to provide at inflated rates while delivering the minimum required. It was a mafia of clerks and contractors, of men in suits who never touched a gun but moved millions with a signature. And at the center of it was a man named Salvatore Buzzi. Buzzi's story is the kind of trajectory that makes sociologists uncomfortable because it refuses easy categorization. He was born in 1949, working-class family, left-wing politics in his youth, genuinely so. He joined leftist militant groups in the 1970s during Italy's Years of Lead, when political violence was routine and ideology justified murder. In 1977, he killed a man, a member of a rival far-right group. Buzzi was convicted of murder and sentenced to 30 years. He served 19. Prison, for some, is an end. For others, it's a graduate program. Buzzi emerged in the mid-1990s with connections, skills, and a new understanding of how power functions. Not through ideology, but through infrastructure. He founded cooperatives, legal entities designed to provide social services, migrant assistance, homeless shelters, job placement programs. Services that sounded noble and were, in theory, necessary. But here's what cooperatives allow: flexible accounting, minimal oversight, contracts awarded without competitive bidding if the cooperative can demonstrate social value. And if you control multiple cooperatives, you can create a network where money flows between entities, subcontracting to each other, inflating costs, skimming at every stage. Buzzi built an empire of misery arbitrage. By the mid-2000s, his cooperatives were receiving tens of millions of euros annually in public funds, contracts to house migrants arriving from North Africa, to provide meals, clothing, legal assistance, language training. The services were supposed to cost a specific amount per person per day, calculated by the government to cover reasonable expenses. But reasonable is negotiable when no one is watching closely. Buzzi's cooperatives billed for services that were never provided. They housed migrants in facilities that violated basic health standards, overcrowded, unsanitary, dangerous, while billing the government for humane accommodations. They invoiced for meals that cost €2 to prepare, but charged 8. They claimed expenses for staff who didn't exist. For transport, that never happened. For medical care, that was aspirin in a paper cup. The profit margin was grotesque. And the victims were people with no leverage. Migrants who couldn't complain. Refugees who didn't know the system. People desperate enough that substandard housing was still better than the streets. Buzzi understood something essential. Suffering is profitable when bureaucracy pays for its alleviation but doesn't verify the result. He wasn't stupid. He knew he needed protection. Political connections, friends in city government, officials who could steer contracts his way, who could delay audits, who could ensure that inconvenient questions were never asked. And this is where Squillante enters the picture. Squillante wasn't running the cooperatives. He wasn't Buzzi's partner in the operational sense. But he was a financier, a facilitator, someone with access to capital, to properties that could be used, to connections in the business community. He helped launder the proceeds. He provided investment opportunities. He made sure that the money flowing through Buzzi's network didn't just sit in bank accounts where it might attract attention, but was converted into assets. Real estate, luxury goods, art, yachts. Yachts especially. Because a yacht is many things, but one thing it is reliably, a store of value that moves. You can buy a yacht in one country, register it in another, moor it in a third. You can claim it as a business expense, corporate hospitality, client entertainment. You can charter it out occasionally to create a paper trail of income. You can depreciate its value for tax purposes while it actually appreciates because historic vessels, if maintained, increase in worth. And if questions arise, you can sail it away. Squillante purchased Fiamma Nera in 2006. The price isn't public, but estimates place it between 2 and 3 million euros. Not extravagant by superyacht standards, modern megayachts cost 10 times that, but for a restored 1912 schooner with fascist provenance, it was significant. Why this yacht? That's the question investigators asked, because Squillante could have bought any number of vessels. Modern yachts with better amenities, newer engines, less baggage. But he chose Mussolini's yacht. He chose a vessel whose name, Black Flame, evoked a very specific aesthetic. And then he spent a fortune restoring it, not just maintaining it, restoring it, to a standard that exceeded historical accuracy and entered the realm of obsession. The hull was stripped and revarnished with 14 coats of marine-grade lacquer. The teak decks were replaced plank by plank, each piece individually fitted and sealed. The brass fittings were removed, polished to mirror brightness, then lacquered to prevent tarnish. The rigging was replaced with custom-manufactured rope that matched the original specifications. Hand-laid linen, waxed, stronger than modern synthetic lines, but exponentially more expensive. Below deck, the salon was restored using photographs from the 1930s. The walnut paneling was repaired where damaged, replaced where missing. The marquetry, geometric patterns inlaid into the wood, was reproduced by an artisan in Florence who specialized in period restoration. The furniture was reupholstered in fabric sourced from the same French mill that had supplied the original velvet, though the mill had closed in 1957 and the fabric had to be commissioned as a custom run. The staterooms were refitted with period-appropriate fixtures, brass lamps with etched glass shades, ceramic wash basins, beds with carved headboards. Even the bedding was historically accurate. Linen sheets, wool blankets, cotton coverlets. The galley was modernized, but subtly. Updated refrigeration, but hidden behind wood panels. A modern stove, but designed to resemble a 1930s marine range. The original copper pots were tracked down at auction and restored. The cost of this restoration exceeded the purchase price of the yacht itself, easily. Estimates suggested Squillante spent another 2 to 3 million euros, making Fiamma Nera perfect. Which raises the question, why? Restoration is one thing. preservation of history, respect for craftsmanship, these are defensible. But this was beyond restoration. This was resurrection, an attempt to return the yacht not to its original condition, but to its idealized state, the version of itself it might have been if history had been kinder. And Scrillante didn't just restore it, he used it, not for charters, not for corporate events, for himself, for private trips along the coast, for evenings moored in Ostia harbor where the yacht became a floating venue for dinners, for meetings, for gatherings of men whose names appeared in no guest logs. The crew, 4 full-time staff, were paid well and said little. A captain with 30 years' experience, 2 deckhands who handled sales and maintenance, a steward who managed the interior and prepared meals. They were loyal, discreet, the kind of employees who understand that their job security depends on selective amnesia. And the yacht, immaculate and silent, absorbed it all. The irony was not lost on investigators, because by 2014, Bootsy's network was unraveling. Wiretaps had been authorized, financial audits were underway, testimonies were being collected from former employees, from migrants who had been housed in the facilities, from whistleblowers who had seen the invoices and knew they were fraudulent. The scale of the operation was staggering. Over a 5-year period, Bootsy's cooperatives had received more than 160 million euros in public funding. Of that, investigators estimated that at least 40 million had been stolen, not spent improperly, stolen, diverted, skimmed, laundered, and some of that money, traced through bank transfers, through shell companies, through intermediaries, had ended up with Scrillante. Specifically, it had ended up on Fiamma Nera. Because here's the grotesque inversion that investigators documented. Public funds intended to house refugees fleeing war and poverty had been used to restore a fascist dictator's yacht to museum-quality perfection. Money meant to feed the desperate had been spent on French velvet and hand-laid rigging. Contracts designed to provide safety had instead funded the maintenance of a floating monument to authoritarianism. It wasn't just corruption. It was symbolically obscene. And the yacht, silent and beautiful, waited in Ostia harbor, its brass gleaming, its varnish flawless, its history polished to a shine. Investigators began building their case in late 2014. Wiretaps, financial records, testimonies. The network was vast, over 100 individuals implicated, from Bootsy at the center to mid-level bureaucrats who signed contracts they knew were inflated, to accountants who falsified reports, to politicians who accepted envelopes in exchange for access. Squillante's role was as a node, a financier, someone who didn't run the scheme but enabled it, who took dirty money and made it clean, who turned theft into assets. And the most visible, most symbolic of those assets was moored in plain sight. By early 2015, prosecutors had enough. Arrest warrants were prepared, seizure orders drafted. The plan was coordinated. Simultaneous raids across Rome and the surrounding region. Properties would be seized, bank accounts frozen, vehicles impounded. And in Ostia, the Guardia di Finanza, Italy's financial police, would board Fiamma Nera. The yacht had survived a dictator's fall. It had survived scuttling and salvage. It had survived decades of obscurity and reinvention. Now it would face the state, not as a victim, not as evidence of heritage, but as proceeds of crime. The date was set, February 2016. The decision to buy Mussolini's yacht was not a bigger ingommercian. Their other common 19 milleries that to form the 2016 filling there nurse it. The assightage of date to replate the snow of your rush of the program. The program believer has been well me the program into the 11, would seem the 2-minute research begins of 30 mille research. The decision to buy Mussolini was not as a confident in the morning. The sitting with any 100 video that they haven't that Mussolini understand. The imminent conflicted the 1930. The date was set. The date was set, but not as a fifth victim. The date was set. The date was set, but as proceeds of crime. The date was set. The date was set, but as proceeds of crime. Not as a victim, not as a mither, but as proceeds of crime with. The date was set. The date was set. The decision to buy Mussolini's yacht was a lot on the program nobility. Because of the latest saved taxes is know that Mussolini's, like Mussolini's wasn't in the morning. The date was set, but as proceeds of crime. The invent in video will have still to get a point in all about it. The nearest either is not even seer because of that kid. The great is unfortunately been ejected with the best state is procreate from a bigger time. The art of Mussolini's is informally an honor to Mussolini's is, as it never been in to avoid of them that the end of the top with the sitting the world. The program feel the matter of year that was releasedly two over the great. The date was set. The date was set, but as proceeds of crime. The decision to buy Mussolini's genitive. The date was set, but as proceeds of crime. The date was set, but as proceeds of crime. The identity's expensive time mither. The other proposing vided is in nothing to gets the great. The date was set, but as proceeds of crime. The Mussolinis could not do it disappeared in the morning. The date was set, but as proceeds of crime. The great is not the informally major infert, but as a other professional program namer. They have not informally by Facebook, but the date was set, but as proceeds of crime. The ultimate research, to is flittic in Westernoff. Within many genrival gived a great here of his country. The moment since the state with mither important. This was an nothing to get. The date was set, but as proceeds of crime. The mither occurs the automate laters were not informally with thought, but if according to the decision within automated the invents, which must abute of all to invents liberty from Asian. The program fitted additive anything word by the world. The automate research pro very other and freeware once existed. The pervidly became one liver wasn't automate was anything set, and month time that tided in something. Now the believe of Mussolini's 1 to 2. The mither program was 1001 then more hit, is the K of fifth and truly to get oppressed the mither. The date was set, but as there two, which must be repetited in the name of. The Tomley is ugrid unsuffed, because of the latest saved is 1, 2. The mither occurred is it not informally feels where large places the two when stand. The automate research was hipted, and after than anything. The grain to the date was dignited to the tax within automate research. But even automate research was of the automate were dignited in the morning. The date was set, was wearing them to the onjally mother research. But faith for the tax, but is the little too great, 1219. But comes to be interview then 4. The deep of places word isn't. Again that everything one know that the 31 support evidence, which were domains them to remind late inventive line. The defensive that first far coming in the video, because of all the world was building a very blent mother become the believe of one of them, but vet is built in a mug evidence leith. But now that the first far breeze then built often, the next percent, the directively literally second believe and a returning to be left, which all the time faith important. The important percentage the team needs of Suvry than one what is considered, which was faith in very deed in with an automate research of livering other percent, along with beteckle plant then placed to the time. Everything that invitements to word, late is the change of the team believing in the morning with very livery evidence. The deep professional program the in the morning was leaving built often because of the Klaus other preventative name, but lived to be ultimate research equal a place. The state before the video was really understand in the world. The great is before the father of everything. The name of created into the free to be one know that the Klaus. The God for the omitted is later, but know that the state one fully other program then will. This again between the ignorant parment of information will be everyone's support. The Middle-earth was really information his any one muddle enough today. The decision to avoid by not inexpensive them, which is real abding for the first forp, is other time. But there's just not one today. The state was crimic program with large private flot rock on the ground of automate research. The mither automate research one too. The midded is the first that support. The either is a very state in particular. The mither he work that most of the program forgiven incredible behavior. The great is considered video, which was long with them to informally other for the first forms. The automate research would deal in more quickly on the midder. The first for real share that it means too when state with this growth is free in particular. The built of this admins, but a considered in ig real filled against to suffer, which was long with a great is advisability. The date was 50 into the free. But probably almost programs implicate, but one to create a real filt against summer. The trival time once exist then lettest in the morning. But then we need to be one to the proofed the automate research and best to the time. The automate research was obvious late the father in the morning. The great is mates of so directed var what of this particular very here along. The date was at former. The great is the release of coming as exact the Genovate program is there. Every think of a lot in particular was all no to sits the question then the father just become. We'd would lead to that exact the place. The great is 56. The Ullini's yacht was not impulsive. Men like Scriante don't make purchases of that magnitude on a whim. They calculate. They consult. They consider what the acquisition signals to others and to themselves. A yacht isn't just recreation. It's a statement of arrival, of permanence, of belonging to a class that exists above scrutiny. But why this yacht? Italy has hundreds of historic vessels, beautiful sailboats from the 1920s and 30s, Mediterranean classics with clean lines and noble histories, yachts owned by industrialists, by artists, by families whose wealth was old enough to be respectable. Scriante could have bought any of them, could have purchased something with less baggage, less association, less weight, but he chose the one that had belonged to Il Duce. There are practical explanations. The schooner was exceptionally well built. Abeking and Rasmussen didn't cut corners. The lines were elegant, the engineering sound. A vessel like that, if maintained, could sail for another century. From a purely nautical perspective, it was an excellent investment. But that's not why he bought it. He bought it because of who had owned it, because of what it represented, because possessing Mussolini's yacht meant inheriting a kind of authority that can't be purchased with money alone, only with money attached to the right symbol. This is how power validates itself, not through achievement, but through proximity to prior power. A criminal doesn't become legitimate by going straight. He becomes legitimate by acquiring the artifacts of legitimacy. A historic home, art with provenance, a yacht that once carried a dictator. The object transfers its history to the owner. It says, I belong in this lineage. I am the heir to this. Scriante understood this, or perhaps he simply felt it. The way certain men gravitate towards symbols without fully articulating why. The yacht wasn't just beautiful, it was significant. It had weight, and owning it meant he had weight too. So he bought it. And then he did something revealing. He made it perfect. Not functional, not seaworthy, perfect. As though the yacht were a shrine and he the priest tasked with its maintenance. The restoration began in 2007 and continued obsessively for years. Scriante hired specialists, not general contractors, but artisans, people who understood historic preservation at the molecular level, wood conservators who could identify the precise species of mahogany used in the hull and source replacements from the same forests, metallurgists who could replicate the brass alloy used in the original fittings, textile historians who could authenticate the weave pattern of the salon upholstery. The project consumed him. Or maybe it simply revealed what was already there, a need to inhabit history, to touch the objects that power had touched, to sit where Mussolini sat, to feel the same teak beneath his feet, the same brass beneath his hand. There's a psychological term for this: object fetishism, the attribution of almost magical significance to a physical thing. But that term feels clinical, inadequate, because what Squilante was doing wasn't irrational. It was entirely rational within the logic of his world. In the criminal economy, legitimacy is the ultimate commodity. You can have money, enormous amounts of it, but if you can't display it, enjoy it, move through society without constant suspicion, what's the point? Wealth without legitimacy is just numbers in an account. It's potential energy that can't be converted into social power. But a yacht, especially this yacht, converts that energy. It allows a man to moor in exclusive harbors, to host gatherings that look like business, to move in circles where questions aren't asked because the yacht itself answers them. It says, "This man has resources. This man has taste. This man belongs." And if the yacht once belonged to Mussolini, even better, because in certain circles, circles that don't speak openly but understand each other, that association isn't a liability, it's a credential. The restoration was completed in phases. First, the hull and structural elements, then the rigging and sails, then the interior, room by room, surface by surface. By 2010, Fiamma Nera was seaworthy again. By 2012, it was historically accurate. By 2014, it was immaculate. The varnish alone required maintenance every 6 months. 14 coats, each one hand-applied, each one sanded between applications. The process took weeks. The teak decks needed to be cleaned with specific solutions that wouldn't degrade the wood or the sealant. The brass fittings were polished weekly, then lacquered to slow tarnish. The sails, 360 square meters of custom-woven canvas, were inspected after every use, repaired if necessary, stored in climate-controlled conditions when not deployed. The annual cost of maintaining Fiamma Nera to this standard exceeded €150,000. That's not including fuel, crew salaries, mooring fees, insurance, or unexpected repairs. That's just the routine preservation required to keep the yacht in exhibition condition. And Squilante paid it. Every year, without fail. Where did the money come from? That was the question investigators asked. Because Squilante's declared income didn't support this. His businesses, property management, a small hospitality firm, consulting services, generated revenue, but nothing close to what he was spending. So they followed the money backward. From Squilante's accounts to shell companies, from shell companies to cooperative networks, from cooperatives to public contracts. And at the end of that chain, Buzi's empire. The connection wasn't direct. Squilante wasn't on Buzi's payroll. He didn't hold a position in any of the cooperatives, but money moved between them. Loans that were never repaid, consulting fees for services that were never defined, property transactions where the sale price didn't match market value, transfers between accounts that had no clear justification. It was a web, deliberate, complex, designed to obscure origin and destination. But investigators are patient. They map networks, they build timelines, they compare declared expenses with actual spending, and eventually, patterns emerge. Between 2008 and 2014, investigators estimated that approximately €4.5 million had moved, directly or indirectly, from Buzi's network to Squilante's control. Not all at once, not in obvious chunks, but steadily, reliably, enough to fund a lifestyle that his legitimate income couldn't support. And a significant portion of that, perhaps 40%, had been spent on the yacht, on varnish, on brass, on sales, on teak, on velvet, on restoration, which meant that public funds allocated to care for refugees had been siphoned into the maintenance of a fascist relic. The symbolism was almost too perfect, as though someone had designed it as satire. Money intended to house the displaced had been spent on a vessel that once hosted a dictator who created displacement. Funds meant to feed the hungry had purchased French fabric for a salon where Mussolini entertained his mistress. Contracts designed to provide safety had instead polished brass fittings to mirror brightness. The yacht didn't just represent corruption, it embodied it. It was corruption made tangible, made beautiful, made something you could board and touch. And it floated in Ostia harbor, visible to anyone who cared to look. Because Squiante didn't hide the yacht. He couldn't. You can't hide a 32-meter schooner. It's too large, too distinctive. The black hull, the white sails, the elegant lines. It drew attention. People photographed it. Tourists asked about it. Locals knew it was there. But no one asked the right questions. Who owns it? Where did the money come from? Why would someone restore a fascist dictator's yacht to this level of perfection? Those questions only became relevant when investigators made them relevant. By late 2015, the case against Buzi's network was solid. Wiretaps had captured conversations that were damning. Financial records had been subpoenaed and analyzed. Witnesses had been interviewed. Former employees, migrants who had lived in the facilities, accountants who had seen the invoices. The scale was enormous. Over 100 individuals implicated. Contracts worth 160 million euros. Estimated theft of at least 40 million, possibly more. Buzi was the primary target. But prosecutors didn't just want convictions. They wanted assets. Because letting criminals keep the proceeds of their crimes, even while imprisoning them, sends a message. Crime pays. You just have to be willing to accept the occasional sentence. So, Italy's anti-mafia laws allow for preventive seizure. Assets can be confiscated before trial, based on the disproportion between legitimate income and observable wealth. The burden of proof shifts. The state doesn't have to prove the assets are criminal proceeds. The owner has to prove they're not. It's authoritarian, yes, but it's effective. And it allows the state to seize yachts. In January 2016, prosecutors finalized the seizure orders, a list of assets belonging to Squiante and other members of the network. Real estate in Rome, in Naples, in coastal towns. Luxury vehicles, Mercedes, BMW, a Maserati. Bank accounts, investment portfolios, art collections, wine cellars. And Fiamma Nera. Total value? 28 million euros. That number is worth pausing on. 28 million. Not 25, not 30. 28. The precision suggests careful calculation. Every property appraised, every vehicle valued, every asset quantified. And of that 28 million, the yacht represented roughly 10%, between 2.5 and 3 million euros, depending on the appraisal method. Which means the yacht wasn't the largest asset, but it was the most visible, the most symbolic, the one that would generate headlines. Because seizing a villa is routine. Seizing a luxury car is bureaucratic. But seizing Mussolini's yacht? That's a story. And the prosecutors knew it. The operation was planned for February. Not announced, not publicized in advance, but coordinated across multiple agencies. The Guardia di Finanza would handle the yacht, local police would secure the properties, financial investigators would freeze the accounts. Simultaneous, overwhelming, designed to prevent any last-minute asset transfers or disappearances. The date was set, February 11th, 2016. The Guardia di Finanza is not a civilian police force. It's a military corps under the Ministry of Economy and Finance. Their jurisdiction is financial crime, smuggling, tax evasion, money laundering. They wear uniforms, gray-green, military cut. They carry weapons. Their boats are fast, utilitarian, painted in the colors of authority. They don't make requests, they execute orders. On the morning of February 11th, multiple units were mobilized, officers briefed, seizure warrants distributed, routes planned. The operation would begin at dawn, before the city fully woke, before targets could be alerted, before assets could be moved. Ostia Harbor at sunrise is quiet. Fishing boats preparing to depart, sailors performing maintenance, the smell of diesel and salt, gulls circling, the water flat, gray, cold. And Fiamma Nera, moored at the end of a private pier, its black hull gleaming even in the early light. The crew would have been aboard. They lived on the yacht when it was moored for extended periods, easier than commuting, and it meant the vessel was never unattended. The captain in his cabin, the steward preparing breakfast, the deckhands checking lines and fenders. Routine. Another morning. Until the patrol boats appeared, 3 of them, gray hulls, institutional, approaching at speed, then slowing as they neared the pier. Not recreational boaters, not harbor officials, the Guardia di Finanza. This is where the visual spectacle becomes almost cinematic. 3 modern, angular, utilitarian vessels surrounding one elegant, historic, immaculate schooner. The contrast is deliberate, the gray against the black, the military precision against the aristocratic lines, the state asserting dominance over private luxury. The boats didn't moor. They held position, engines idling, officers visible on deck. And then a launch, a rigid inflatable boat deployed from one of the patrol vessels. 6 officers, armed though weapons holstered. They approached the yacht's stern, where a boarding ladder was permanently rigged. The captain would have seen them by now, would have stepped onto the deck, would have known immediately what this was. You don't spend 30 years at sea without understanding authority when it arrives. The officers boarded, polite, formal, efficient. No shouting, no drama, just documents presented, warrants displayed, explanations given in the clipped language of legal procedure. This vessel is subject to preventive seizure under Law 646/1982, Rognoni La Torre, Article 2 ter. You are required to vacate immediately. The yacht is now property of the Italian state pending judicial review. The crew would have been given minutes. Gather personal belongings. No cargo, no files, nothing belonging to the yacht. Just personal items, clothing, toiletries, a book someone was reading. And then they would have disembarked, walked down the boarding ladder onto the inflatable, been ferried to the pier, watched as officers remained aboard Fiamma Nera, securing hatches, beginning inventory, photographing every surface. The yacht didn't resist. Ships don't. They sit where they're moored and wait for whoever holds the deed to decide what happens next. But something had shifted. For 80 years, Fiamma Nera had belonged to power, to kaisers, to fascists, to wealthy men who lived in the gray space between legitimacy and crime. Now, it belonged to the state. Not as a gift, not as tribute, but as evidence. The seizure operation continued through the morning. By noon, officers had completed the initial inventory. Every room photographed, every fitting catalogued, the condition of the vessel documented in forensic detail. And then the yacht was sealed, hatches locked, access restricted. A notice posted on the pier, property under seizure, no trespassing. Fiamma Nera would remain in Ostia Harbor, but it was no longer Squillantes. It was frozen, a piece of evidence, a symbol seized by the state to prove that even the most elegant, the most historically significant, the most carefully maintained objects can be confiscated if the money that bought them was stolen. The news broke that evening. Headlines across Italy. Mafia Capitale, 28 million in assets seized. Mussolini's yacht confiscated in corruption probe. Black flame extinguished. Historic vessel seized from criminal network. The yacht, silent in its mooring, became a photograph, an illustration, a symbol in newspapers, on television, in courtrooms where prosecutors would argue that men like Scrillante had built empires on stolen suffering. And the yacht, as always, absorbed the moment, waiting, patient, as it had waited before. February 11, 2016. Dawn had not yet broken completely when the operation began. Ostia Harbor holds approximately 800 berths, sailboats, motorboats, fishing vessels, a handful of larger yachts. Most of them unremarkable, functional, the kind of boats people use, not display. Fiamma Nera occupied a premium position at the eastern end of the marina. Private pier, direct access. The kind of mooring that costs 4 times the standard rate and comes with amenities. Fresh water on demand, electrical hookups, security patrols, discretion. The yacht had been there for 3 months, longer than usual. Typically, Scrillante sailed it during warmer seasons, kept it moving, visible in different ports along the coast. But winter mooring was routine. Maintenance season. Time for repairs, for inspections, for the meticulous preservation work that kept the vessel pristine. The crew would have been awake, not because they anticipated anything, they didn't, but because dawn on a yacht means work begins. Checking systems, testing bilge pumps, inspecting lines. The routine never stops. A vessel is either being maintained or it's degrading. There's no neutral state. The captain, a man named Luca Moretti, though his name appears nowhere in official records, only in later journalistic accounts, had been with the yacht for 6 years. He knew its systems better than anyone. Every valve, every through-hull fitting, every idiosyncrasy in the engine timing. He could feel when something was wrong before instruments registered it. He was 52, former merchant marine, had sailed everything from container ships to racing yachts before settling into the quieter, better-paid world of private vessels. He didn't ask questions about where money came from. That wasn't his job. His job was to keep the yacht operational, safe, and immaculate. And he was very good at his job. The 2 deckhands, younger, less experienced, handled the physical labor, polishing brass, cleaning teak, managing sails when the yacht was underway. They lived aboard during mooring periods, slept in crew quarters forward, ate in the small galley separate from the main salon. The steward, a woman in her 40s, professional, efficient, managed the interior. She cleaned cabins that were rarely used. She inventoried supplies that barely depleted. She prepared meals for a crew of 4 and occasionally for Scrillante and whatever guests he brought aboard. It was a good job, stable, well paid, and it required a very specific skill, selective attention. You noticed what needed noticing: a worn line, a loose fitting, a supply running low. You didn't notice conversations, guests, the contents of briefcases left in the salon. This morning, Moretti was on deck by 6:15. The sun wasn't visible yet, just a gray lightening along the eastern horizon. Cold. The kind of damp February cold that settles into your bones. He was inspecting the starboard rigging when he saw the patrol boats, 3 of them, coming from the harbor entrance. Not fast, but deliberate. Formation maintained. Military precision. He knew immediately they were Guardia di Finanza. The profile, the markings, the way they moved. And he knew they were coming here. You don't spend 6 years on a yacht owned by a man like Scrillante without understanding that this moment might arrive. You don't ask questions, but you're not naive. You know the lifestyle doesn't match the declared income. You know the guests who come aboard don't leave business cards. You know that silence is a job requirement for a reason. So when Moretti saw the patrol boats, he didn't panic. He didn't alert anyone. He simply stood on deck and waited. The boats approached, slowed, held position 30 meters off the stern, engines idling. 6 officers visible on the lead vessel, armed, though weapons remained holstered. Then a rigid inflatable deployed. 6 officers boarded it. The small boat accelerated, closing the distance quickly, then came alongside Fiamma Nera's boarding ladder. Moretti walked to the stern, met them as they came aboard. The lead officer, a lieutenant, mid-30s, carrying a leather portfolio, stepped onto the deck. The other 5 followed. Spread out, not aggressive, but positioned, covering exits, making clear that this wasn't a conversation, it was an operation. Captain Luca Moretti? Yes. This vessel is subject to immediate preventive seizure under Law 646/1982, Article 2, ter. We have a judicial order authorizing confiscation of all assets belonging to Salvatore Squillante. Do you understand? Moretti nodded. No point arguing. No point asking questions. You and your crew have 15 minutes to collect personal belongings and disembark. Nothing belonging to the vessel. No documents. No equipment. Personal items only. Do you understand? Yes. Is the owner aboard? No. He hasn't been here in 3 weeks. The officer made a note, then gestured to his team. 2 officers moved toward the forward hatch, heading below deck. 2 remained on the main deck. 1 stayed at the boarding ladder. Moretti went below, found the deckhands in the galley already awake, already sensing something was wrong. The steward emerged from her cabin, dressed, alert. Guardia di Finanza. Seizure order. We have 15 minutes to get off. No one spoke. They knew what it meant. They moved quickly. Packed bags, clothing, toiletries, a few books, personal electronics. Nothing valuable. Nothing that could be disputed. One deckhand had a watch his grandfather had given him. He hesitated, wondering if they'd claim it. Moretti told him to take it. If it's yours, take it. They're not here for your watch. 10 minutes later, the crew stood on deck with their bags. The officers had been through every cabin, every hold, every storage locker, photographing, making notes, not confiscating anything yet, just documenting. The lieutenant returned to the deck, looked at Moretti. Anything we should know? Any hazards? Any systems that need monitoring? Moretti appreciated the question. Professional courtesy. Bilge pump runs automatically every 6 hours. If it fails, you'll know within 12 hours. Water will start accumulating in the forward compartment. Engine needs to be run once a week to keep systems lubricated. Fresh water tanks are full. Fuel at 60%. The lieutenant made notes. Understood. You'll be contacted if we need technical consultation. For now, you're dismissed. Moretti nodded, looked at his crew. They descended the boarding ladder into the inflatable, were ferried to the pier, stood there, holding their bags, watching as officers remained aboard Fiamma Nera. The yacht sat in the water, black hull reflecting the gray morning light, silent, waiting. Moretti would later tell a journalist, off the record, that it felt like watching someone die. Not violently, quietly. The yacht didn't resist. It simply stopped being what it had been and became something else. Evidence. Property. A piece in an investigation. The seizure operation at the harbor was one part of a coordinated strike across Rome and the surrounding region. Simultaneous raids at 17 locations, properties searched, vehicles impounded, bank accounts frozen. The precision was overwhelming. Every target hit within a 90-minute window. No leaks, no warnings, no opportunity for assets to be moved. At Squillante's villa outside Rome, officers found documents, financial records, correspondence. Nothing incriminating on its surface, but when cross-referenced with the cooperative network's paperwork, patterns emerged. Payments that coincided, transfers that mirrored contract awards, dates that aligned with Buzzi's operations. At his office in the city, more records, property deeds, investment accounts, a safe containing 140,000 euros in cash. Not illegal. People are allowed to keep cash. But combined with everything else, it suggested a man who didn't trust banks completely, who kept reserves accessible. At other locations tied to the network, more documentation, more cash, more evidence of a system designed to move public funds into private hands. By noon, the operation was complete. Assets secured. Individuals detained for questioning. Lawyers notified. The legal machinery activated. And in Ostia, Fiamma Nera sat under guard, silent. The yacht remained in the harbor for weeks, moored, sealed, accessible only to investigators conducting their forensic accounting. Because seizing the yacht was one thing, proving it should remain seized required something else: tracing the money. Italian anti-mafia law allows preventive seizure based on disproportion. If someone's lifestyle exceeds their declared income, assets can be confiscated. But to make that seizure permanent, prosecutors need to demonstrate, on the balance of probabilities, that the assets were purchased with criminal proceeds. For Fiamma Nera, this meant constructing a financial timeline. When was it purchased? For how much? Where did the purchase funds originate? What accounts were used? Were there loans, gifts, investment returns? And could those sources be traced back to Squiante's legitimate income, or did they connect to the cooperative network? Financial investigators spent months on this, following wire transfers between banks, subpoenaing account records, interviewing accountants, comparing dates of payments with dates of contract awards. What they found was a pattern. Not a smoking gun, there rarely is in financial crime, but a pattern. In 2006, when Squiante purchased the yacht, he paid 2.4 million euros. The funds came from three sources: a loan from a private bank, 800,000 euros, a sale of property in Naples, 1 million euros, and a direct transfer from his primary business account, 600,000 euros. On the surface, legitimate, but investigators dug deeper. The loan from the private bank was collateralized by property Squiante owned in Rome. That property had been purchased in 2004 for 1.2 million euros. The purchase funds for that property came from another loan, backed by a different property, which had been purchased with funds from another source. They followed the chain backward: property purchases, business investments, loans, and repayments. And at several points in the chain, funds connected to entities that had received contracts from cooperatives within Bootsy's network. Not direct payments, not obvious transfers, but connections. A consulting company that Squiante partially owned had received fees from a cooperative. Those fees were paid shortly before Squiante made a property purchase. The consulting company had no obvious deliverables, no reports, no defined services, just fees paid for business advisory services. This pattern repeated, multiple instances: fees for undefined services, payments coinciding with major purchases, entities connected to the cooperative network transferring funds to entities connected to Squiante. Individually, any single transaction could be explained. Coincidence, legitimate business. But collectively, the pattern suggested something else: a system for moving money from public contracts into Squiante's control, laundered through enough intermediary steps to create plausible deniability. And a significant portion of that money had funded the purchase and restoration of Fiamma Nera. Investigators estimated that between 2006 and 2014, approximately 3.8 million euros connected directly or indirectly to the cooperative network had been spent on the yacht. Purchase price, restoration costs, maintenance, crew salaries, mooring fees. Nearly 4 million euros. Stolen from public funds intended to help refugees, spent on varnish and brass and teak and sails. The numbers were included in the prosecution's filings, presented as evidence not just of corruption, but of moral bankruptcy, because the inversion was too perfect to ignore. Money meant to house the displaced had instead maintained a vessel that once served a dictator who created displacement. Funds intended to care for the vulnerable had been converted into luxury for a man connected to a network that profited from their suffering. The yacht became a symbol in the trial, not the primary evidence. There were hundreds of pages of financial records, wiretaps, testimonies, but the yacht was the image that journalists used, the photograph that accompanied articles, the visual shorthand for everything wrong with the scheme. Fiamma Nera in Ostia Harbor, black hull gleaming, elegant lines, beautiful, and confiscated. The trial moved slowly. Italian judicial proceedings are not rushed. Months of pre-trial motions, challenges to the seizure orders, appeals, counter-appeals. Squillante's lawyers argued that the financial connections were circumstantial, that his business dealings with the cooperatives were legitimate, that consulting fees were real services, that the yacht had been purchased with legally obtained funds and its seizure was unjustified. Prosecutors countered with the pattern, the timeline, the disproportion between income and spending, the connections, repeated too many times to be coincidental. Buzzi, at the center of the network, faced more serious charges: Mafia association, fraud, money laundering. He was convicted in 2017, sentenced to 19 years, reduced on appeal to 12. Squillante faced lesser charges, not Mafia association. Prosecutors couldn't prove he was a formal member of the network, but money laundering, fraud, receiving stolen goods. He was convicted in 2018, sentenced to 6 years. The seizure of his assets, including Fiamma Nera, was made permanent. The yacht became property of the Italian state, not to be sold, not to be used, but to be held. A trophy, a reminder. There's a concept in Italian anti-mafia law called social reuse. Assets confiscated from criminals can be repurposed for public benefit. Properties converted into schools, community centers, social housing. Vehicles used by municipalities. Farms operated as cooperatives. The idea is restorative, to take what was stolen and return it, transformed, to the community. But what do you do with a fascist dictator's yacht? You can't turn it into a school. You can't house refugees on it. The irony would be too grotesque. You can't sell it. That would just put it back into private hands. And who would buy it? Someone else with questionable wealth and a taste for symbols? So Fiamma Nera remains, moored, maintained minimally, enough to prevent degradation, not enough to restore its former perfection. The varnish is dulling, the brass is tarnishing, the teak is weathering. It sits in a state impound facility now, not Ostia anymore. A less visible location, a warehouse for confiscated assets. Boats, cars, paintings, furniture, objects waiting for judges to decide their fate. The yacht is inspected periodically, bilge pumps tested, hull checked for damage, but no restoration, no polishing, no care beyond basic preservation. It's functional, it could sail, if someone wanted it to, but no one does, because the yacht is no longer just an object. It's a question. What does it mean that this vessel survived? That it passed from Kaisers to fascists to criminals? That it was scuttled and raised, restored and seized, cherished and confiscated? Some objects accumulate history. They become repositories of every hand that held them, every purpose they served. And Fiamma Nera has accumulated more than most. It carried a dictator's secrets. It floated on stolen funds. It gleamed with the labor of artisans paid by refugees suffering. And now it sits, waiting. The Italian state hasn't decided what to do with it. There are proposals. Turn it into a museum, a floating exhibit on the banality of corruption. Donate it to a maritime preservation society. Scrap it entirely, erase it, end the lineage. But for now, it simply exists. The final chapter of this story hasn't been written yet. Maybe it never will be, because the yacht isn't finished. It's paused, suspended between identities. Is it a historical artifact? A piece of maritime heritage that should be preserved regardless of its associations? Or is it a monument to power's continuity? Evidence that certain symbols never die, They just wait for the next hand to claim them. The yacht doesn't answer. It sits in the water, black hull fading, brass dulling, wood weathering slowly under tarps that aren't quite adequate. And perhaps that's fitting. Because the real story of Fiamma Nera isn't about the vessel. It's about what the vessel represents: the hunger for dominance, the need to possess symbols of authority, the belief that owning history makes you historical. 3 eras, 3 regimes, the same hunger. In 1912, it was built for Kaisers, for the old world, confident in its permanence. In 1930, it was claimed by fascism, for a new world, built on violence and spectacle. In 2006, it was acquired by a criminal network, for a world that learned to dress theft in bureaucracy. And in 2016, it was seized by the state, proof that even the most elegant, most carefully maintained illusions can be confiscated. But the yacht survives, not as a ship anymore, as a question. Did the yacht survive history, or did history keep choosing it? Did it attract power, or simply reflect whoever held the wheel? And when the state finally decides what to do with it, scrap it, preserve it, forget it, will that decision matter? Or will the yacht, in some form, simply wait for the next regime to claim it? The answer is in the harbor, in the warehouse, in the slow degradation of varnish and brass. The yacht is still there, waiting. It always has been.